Hi everyone, it's Dr. Marks, and our topic for today are arguments against free trade. So what kinds of things are thrown out there when people are trying to say, yeah, we should have protectionism? So arguments against free trade. Before we move on to that though, let's remember we've been discussing the idea of free trade, and free trade is when countries trade without trade barriers. So at this point you already understand that when we have free trade, goods can freely flow between countries. We've talked about examples with the US and Canada and Mexico, and goods can freely flow, and that means there are no tariffs, no quotas, and no other kinds of trade barriers that are in place. We don't have those things that we typically think of as restricting trade. Economists, as we've already discussed, are overwhelmingly in favor of free trade. But you will still find lots of discussion about how free trade is bad. And one thing I want to remind you about is that not every single person is a winner under free trade. We've talked about that free trade is good for a country's economy. It can propel economic growth. It can create new opportunities, but there will be some trade-offs. Nevertheless, the gains generally outweigh any of the costs. My objective for this lecture is to overview some of those arguments against free trade, but we need to look at them through the lens of economics to get a general sense of the validity of the argument. So we need to wear our economist hat and try to really think through if it's a legitimate reason to argue against free trade. In other words, we need to try to determine when the idea might have some merit. And it turns out there are some cases when arguing against free trade can have some merit. As I present these, please understand they're presented in no particular order. So these are not in order of importance or frequency of use or anything like that. The first argument that we often hear is the national security argument. The national security argument. This argument suggests that trade barriers are important for national security. Trade barriers are important for national security. In other words, we need to practice protectionism, and we can justify it on the grounds of it being important for national security. Now, this argument often refers to wartime, and if we are at war, then maybe this might have some validity. Imagine you're at war, but you're not able to get fabrics for making military uniforms. Well, that would be problematic, right? So think about what we're saying. If we have free trade, then we're not going to be producing a whole lot of textiles in our country. So if we have protectionism, we're going to use trade barriers to make sure to keep out competition or some of the competition, and that's going to ensure that we continue to have a textile industry. So make sure you understand the connections there, that by having protectionism, we produce more things in the United States. We keep industries that aren't competitive, but nevertheless, they are there. So that would be the argument, that we don't want to lose our textile industry because we might need to make military uniforms one day. Or imagine having food insecurity during wartime. So again, the logic is that if we have protectionism and we protect domestic farmers in the United States from competition abroad, well, we'll produce more food. And we're going to need to rely on that food when we have wartime. So national security could be at stake. But then, of course, the economist in me says, well, we have to ask how big this risk really is. Do we really need to justify this on the grounds of national security? Can we really state that case? For example, are we going to war with Central America? Is there some reason that we can't just rely on Central America? Seems like we can get all the things we need. We can rely on getting products from those countries. We're not going to war with Costa Rica. We're not going to war most likely with Honduras or El Salvador or Belize. So what is the real risk here? Do we really need to say we need protectionism and quota and tariffs and trade barriers simply to ensure that we keep certain industries that we're not competitive in just because we might have to rely on them at some point? Doesn't seem very valid. Are there ways around these risks, for example? Well, can't we just stockpile stuff during times of war? If we are at war, then okay, we need to tighten our belts and maybe we buy a bunch of stuff or we find other countries to trade with. The bottom line is that it's just hard to justify having trade barriers in place simply to keep industries in our country that might not otherwise be in our country or wouldn't be as big just so that we can protect our national security interests. So this argument doesn't really hold a lot of water. However, the infant industry argument, our second argument, might actually hold some water in some circumstances. So number 2 is the infant industry argument. This argument argues that protectionism is warranted for emerging industries, that we need to continue protectionism, we need to have trade barriers to protect emerging industries. We often see this argument about wanting to protect the emerging industries in reference to developing countries. And it's probably reasonable at times that there are some emerging industries that need this kind of protection. The idea is that new industries in a country, especially a developing country, are at a disadvantage, right? They're new. All the firms are new. And if these firms and industries are new, then they can't compete with those that are already well developed in developing countries, right? So imagine being the new kid on the block and you're trying to compete with all of those European countries and Canada and the United States. It's just really challenging. Those countries have had these industries much longer, right? They've been around a lot longer. They have better technology, better training. So the idea is, make sure you're connecting the dots here, that if we use protectionism, let's say we are Honduras, if we use protectionism to keep out the competition, then we can sell more in our country. But if we let the cheap products from the established countries enter our markets, well, it's hard for our new industries and new firms to compete. So an example might be maybe Costa Rica decides to go into the semiconductor industry, and they're brand new to semiconductors, but Costa Rica might be a good place to produce them because they've got an educated workforce. Well, if the semiconductor industry is new in Costa Rica, we might consider that an emerging industry, but it's going to take a few years for it really to get off the ground and to be competitive. So the argument is maybe we protect the semiconductor industry in Costa Rica for a few years to let it get established, to kind of let it get some legs under it. And then we can decide later what to do about eliminating trade barriers. But the idea is keep the trade barriers there and protect the Costa Rican semiconductor industry from competition for just a while. Now, it turns out that the infant industry argument was actually the basis for the United States trade policy after gaining independence from England. Now, I know you know this history, right? So we gain independence from England, but remember, we're a pretty new country. And this idea was actually pushed by Alexander Hamilton. And in case you don't remember who that is, I know you know the name, but he was our first Secretary of the Treasury. So he's basically arguing, look, American industries need time to mature, right? You're not good at something immediately, right? It takes some time to gain the maturity and the experience. And so while our new American industries are becoming mature and getting well established, They need protection from those established industries in England. So Alexander Hamilton is basically saying, look, on the basis of the infant industry argument, we should continue to exhibit protectionism, continue to have trade barriers in place. Let's keep out some of those cheaper English goods. The problem is that often trade barriers stay in place too long. You're getting a really good situation, right? And special interest groups want to secure the benefits. So they worked hard to secure these benefits, right? Protection from the competition. That's a great benefit, right? Protection from competition. But they get it for a few years and they enjoy being protected from competition. And now they don't want to give up that benefit. Well, totally makes sense to me, right? If somebody gives you a big advantage, you don't want to give that advantage away. So these special interest groups fight to keep them. For example, let's think about sugar. Our farmers are not competitive in the market for sugar. If we don't have trade barriers, those farmers will go out of business. So guys, do you think the farmers are just sitting around saying, hey, I hope they never eliminate those trade barriers on sugar? Of course not. They have organized themselves. They lobby. This is a special interest group. And they want to fight to retain a benefit that was given to them because it helps them tremendously, right? Well, the same thing's going to be true with these infant industries. They get a benefit and they want to fight to keep it. Moving on to our third reason that we see people criticizing or arguing against free trade is on the basis of environmental regulation. So we call this the environmental argument. Number 3, the environmental argument. Well, we know that most countries have environmental standards in place, right? Especially for things like food. So countries all have rules about the environmental standards. So if another country does not meet those standards, well, think about it, then you can't import their goods. This would be a reason you might say, no, we are not going to import things from this country, or we're going to limit things in certain ways. We're going to keep those products out. For example, let's think about use of hormones in meat. Well, American consumers don't want to import beef from other countries if that beef does not meet U.S. standards for hormones in meat. So, on the basis of environmental reasons, you can keep competition out. It's a trade barrier, right? An example would be bananas in the European Union. Well, the European Union has pesticide standards that are stricter than international standards. In other words, a lot of other countries have a lower standard, but the European Union has a much higher standard. African nations, therefore, are restricted from sending bananas to the European Union, at least in the past. Now, this may have changed, but this is a great example. So, basically, the European Union is saying to African nations, you know what? You guys don't meet our environmental standards, and because you don't meet our environmental standards, we can't import from you. So this, again, would be an argument against free trade, because under free trade, those African bananas are coming in. But of course, we understand that this results in huge losses for African nations. And I found an old study, of course, it's back from 2005, and it concluded that the African banana exporters lost something like $400 million in sales because now they don't have access to the European Union market. So that would be a trade barrier that's being justified on the basis of environmental reasons. It's interesting, in my reading, some people argued that countries might use environmental regulations to be strategic. Now, what do I mean by that when I say that some countries use environmental regulations to be strategic? Well, what I mean is that they put a regulation in place simply to justify a trade barrier. In other words, it kind of masks or camouflage as a trade barrier, right? I mean, like, oh no, we can't trade with that country for this product because there's a regulation in place. But the regulation was only put in place so that they could point to it and use it as a trade barrier. So I thought that was interesting. Of course, the bottom line is that this kind of restriction could have big consequences for developing nations, right? When countries use the environmental argument to restrict imports, well, it means that these developing nations may find themselves shut out of markets. Right? Think about Africa being shut out of the European Union. That's a huge market, right? And so if on environmental regulation standards, Africa can't sell bananas to the European Union, that's a lot of money lost because that's a very large market. And that hurts African banana exporters. And of course, it's going to hurt the economies of African nations that sell a lot of bananas around the world. The fourth argument is the child labor argument. The child labor argument. There are some that argue against international trade when child labor is employed. So if you're thinking about trading with a country and an industry that employs child labor, then some would say, oh no, we can't do that. We can't trade when there's child labor involved. But it is true. Children work in many of the poorest nations. So let's just get that point out right now, that it is true that there are countries in which children do work, and they work at a young age. And we all hate that for them, right? But here's the deal. Families cannot support themselves otherwise. There are countries where people are so poor that if the children do not also work, the family cannot make ends meet. They cannot support themselves. And that's just a reality, folks. It's also a reality that in some countries, there are no laws restricting use of child labor. There's not a huge number of countries, right? And it's not going to be the developed countries, right? It's going to be the poorest of the developing countries. But there are countries that have no laws making child labor illegal. So here's the deal. You want to import from a country and an industry in that country that uses child labor, but child labor is not illegal. But yet, there are people that will say on that basis, we should put in a trade barrier and not allow importation. The argument here, though, is if we trade with these countries that are employing children, that have no laws restricting it, that have no laws making it illegal, the argument is that then, as we do more and more trades, as there's more and more trading activity, more factories will open up in that country. And that can be a good thing, right? When more factories open up, there are more jobs. But in these countries, demand for child labor will also increase, right? Children are a labor source in some countries. So if we trade with these countries and support trade with these countries, more factories open and the demand for child labor increases. And we all agree, we would rather see all children getting an education, right? So for a lot of people, they say, oh, we cannot support this. We cannot trade with countries that use child labor because we want them to get an education. All right, that makes sense. But here's the thing. That's not the reality in the poorest places in the world. In the poorest places in the world, those children may not get an education either way. It's just not the reality in the poorest places in the world, especially if education is not free. So think about it. You have some of the poorest countries in the world and some of the poorest families in those super poor countries where education is not free. So you tell me, if that child doesn't go work in that factory, are they getting an education? Are they going to school? Is that the reality? So we can want all we want for these children to be able to get an education, but not trading with them doesn't make it happen. That's the reality. The other thing we need to ask as economists is, are there unintended consequences if we stop trading with these countries and industries that are relying on child labor? Are there unintended consequences? Because we always have to think through the unintended consequences. And the unintended consequences are that sometimes children suffer a far worse fate. I mean, working as a child isn't great, but guys, there are so many worse things in the poorest countries in the world. So if families don't have sufficient income, let's think about what might happen for those poorest families in the poorest places in the world who don't have sufficient income because there's not enough trade and their children can't find jobs. Think about what happens. Those children move on to other activities. Well, if they can't find jobs in a sweatshop, for example, or in a rock quarry or something like that, they're going to move on to other activities. What are those activities? Well, it could be begging, it could be scavenging, it could be prostitution, and in more extreme cases, those children might be sold or they might be given away by families to be trafficked. So guys, you tell me, what's better, child labor or their alternatives? So there are some real unintended consequences when we stop trading. And we see this when people oppose sweatshops. As you know, there's a big movement that's anti-sweatshop because of child labor. That's one reason. But we also know that the alternatives for the children who don't get the jobs any longer are far worse. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, do we make these children's lives better by refusing to trade? Do we make these children's lives better by refusing to trade? And the answer is no. The best thing for these children is trade. More trade means more economic activity. It means more jobs, which leads to higher incomes, which is better for their standard of living. It keeps them from having to be involved in begging and scavenging and prostitution. It reduces frequency and probability of families selling their children or giving them away to be trafficked. The child labor argument is a hard one to see through, but you have to think about it like an economist. And nobody loves the idea that children are working. But we have to think about what would their next best alternative be. Number 5, the job protection argument. Now, this argument is the one that resonates the most with people. And I understand why. The job protection argument. And it kind of overlaps some of the other things we've talked about. The argument is that free trade will eliminate some jobs. And that's an absolutely true statement. If we have free trade, there will be some jobs that are eliminated. For example, workers in the U.S. textile industry are hurt by free trade. Why would workers in the U.S. textile industry be hurt by free trade? The reason is that textiles are so much cheaper in Asia and they're so much cheaper in Central America. Look, our textile industry cannot compete globally. It's hard for our American producers to compete, plain and simple. So if we have free trade, they are not going to win. They're going to be out-competed. So we need to understand that these American textile jobs only exist when there is protectionism. Those American textile jobs only exist because of protectionism. Same thing if we looked at sugar. Our sugar farmers cannot compete in the global marketplace because their prices are way too high. Their costs are too high. Guys, if we just let in a whole lot of sugar through free trade, all those sugar jobs go away. All those sugar farmers have to find something to do. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a reality. Remember, not every single person benefits under free trade. The economy benefits, the average person benefits, but there are jobs that will be lost. As we said, free trade will eliminate our textile industry because we are not competitive, and for that reason, jobs will be lost, without a doubt. But free trade means that other industries will grow. So while under free trade, we're not going to have a comparative advantage in textiles, we will have a comparative advantage in other things. So those other industries will grow because now, think about it, we can sell those things all over the world more cheaply because there are no barriers. So some jobs are lost and other jobs are gained. And those industries that grow and those jobs that are gained are ones for which we have a comparative advantage. So be clear, with free trade, some jobs are lost, but other jobs are gained. And the gains are going to be in those areas, in those industries for which we have a comparative advantage. In the long run, the job prospects in an economy are going to improve. Yeah, that textile worker has lost his job, and that is sad. But overall, job prospects will improve. The textile worker, however, is not immediately absorbed into other industries. And this is the problem, right? We shouldn't keep the textile industry around if we're not competitive. We shouldn't have policies simply to protect some jobs. That would make no sense. But the downside is that the textile worker is not immediately absorbed into those other industries, right? The textile worker doesn't all of a sudden become an auto manufacturer, right? It's going to take some time. That textile worker might need retraining. They might need retooling. It's going to be a period of transition for the textile worker. But that's the reality. So as an example, let me make sure you understand the argument here. Suppose we buy imported televisions. Now we could make our own televisions, but suppose we save $100 per television by buying imported televisions. And you saved $100 and I saved $100 and your brother and the guy down the road, everyone is saving $100 when they buy imported televisions. That's now $100 in our pocket. And we're going to take that money and spend it in other ways. And maybe we're, going to get our house painted and get new glasses or get some, burgers and eat out more. You get the idea, right? So by importing things, it frees up resources for us to spend in other industries. So what I'm arguing is that jewelry industry might expand. The fast food hamburger industry might expand. We might sell more cars domestically. We might sell more glasses domestically. We might have more work for house painters. These are just some silly examples, but you get the idea. We're going to lose some jobs in the domestic television industry, right? There will be fewer people employed to make domestic televisions, American-made televisions. But the trade-off is that all the other places our money goes, those industries will expand. So let's wrap this up. We've gone through a number of arguments to defend protectionism, right? To argue that free trade is bad and having trade barriers is good. None are overly compelling. We did talk about where some have some validity. For example, the infant industry argument probably makes some sense as long as you're not using it to justify keeping those barriers in place many, many years down the road. When we think about the idea of free trade, it can be hard to focus on the long-run benefits that come with free trade because it is true, there's going to be some short-run trade-offs. We just talked about some industries like the textile jobs might disappear. But in the long run, we're going to see more economic growth. But people are going to focus on the costs, right? They're going to focus on those short-run trade-offs, and that is the challenge. in the long run, economies are going to grow, and that is what makes free trade good. So thanks for listening, gang. Let me know if you have any questions and have a fantastic day.